Hello, everybody. I am David,
And I'm Tristan.
and we are
The
The Magic
Magic
Mechanics.
Mechanics.
Welcome back. We are on episode 3 of our podcast, and we're going to be talking about Affinity and beyond. Let's get right into it.
Affinity is a static ability that functions while the spell with Affinity is on the stack. For example, Affinity for artifacts is the most popular kind of Affinity, but there is also Affinity for each basic land type, and the Affinity ability does stack.
What Affinity does is it reduces the cost of spells for, like, let's say Affinity for artifact, it reduces the cost of a spell for each artifact you have. So if you have 2 artifacts, you have 2 colorless reduced on whatever spell you're trying to cast, all the way up to however many artifacts you have. So the thing I love about it is the cost reduction because you can get crazy big spells for practically free, depending on if you have a color in the CMC or not, but you can do quite a lot of things with it. Like Tristan said, it does stack. So there's a card called Mycosynth Golem that allows artifact creatures to have affinity for artifacts. So, like, let's say we have Mycosynth Golem, which already has affinity for artifacts. Then you have a Mycosynth Golem on the battlefield. It gives your Mycosynth Golem double times the affinity for artifacts, which means if you have 2 creatures or 2 artifacts on the battlefield, it reduces the cost by 4, which is quite boggling.
And this also, Mycosynth Golem, that is, reduces the cost of like Blightsteel Colossus and other giant artifact creatures, and it also goes into the X cost of Walking Ballista and anything else that's also like that, which is crazy.
Yeah, so there are a total of 22 cards that have affinity on them. Again, not all of them are going to have affinity for artifacts, but what Tristan and I focused on was affinity for artifacts, since that's the majority of the cards that are in there. So let's go ahead and get right into our decks.
So I made an Is It deck, and so that's blue red. And basically, what I wanted to do was put a lot of 1/1 Thopter creatures out that were artifacts, and then play my big thing, Brood Star, which has affinity for artifacts. And it originally cost 10 mana, 8 colorless, and 2 blue, and has flying, affinity for artifacts, and its power and toughness are equal to each number of artifacts that I control, which is a great card considering that I can have a ton of Thopters out in a short amount of time. And then I have things like Whirler Rogue, which allows me to tap 2 untapped artifacts and give another creature unblockable until the end of turn, which pretty much seals the deal in the game. And I also have a lot more things that generate Thopter tokens, like Efficient Construction, and that's whenever I cast an artifact to create a 1/1 Thopter. And then Thopter Spying Network, which is at the beginning of my upkeep. If I control an artifact, I create a 1/1 Thopter. And I have 4 of each of those enchantments, and so I'm just pumping out Thopters each turn. And I also have 4 lands called Foundry of the Consuls, which allows me to tap for colorless and or pay 5, tap, and sacrifice it, and create 2 colorless Thopter artifacts with flying, just in case I need to do that in an emergency or something. And then I also have 2 of these cards called Goblin Charbelcher, which is an artifact for 4 mana, and I can pay 3 and tap it and reveal cards from the top of my library until I reveal a land card. And then the Goblin Charbelcher deals damage equal to the number of cards to any target. And then if the revealed land card was a mountain, Goblin Charbelcher deals double that damage instead, which is also great for my deck because I am playing blue and red. So there's a small chance I'll hit a mountain, and when I do, it does a ton of damage normally.
Yes, which it did quite a lot of damage. Again, typically what Tristan and I do is we build 2 decks. We're trying not to build the same deck, even though we are building around the same ability. We're trying to build 2 completely different decks. Some things
Yeah.
that we do use are pretty similar. Like he did say Thopter Spy Network. He actually gave me that idea, and I was like, that's a perfect card for Affinity. So I actually threw it into my deck.
Right. And then I also had a useful card called Machinate, and it is 1 colorless and 2 blue mana, and it's an instant, and it says you may look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of artifacts you control, and I can put one of those cards into my hand and the rest on the bottom in any order. And this is great just to dig through my deck to try to find that game-winning Brute Star, especially if I have, like 5 to 10 artifacts on the field. I'm picking up like 10 cards and looking through all of them, and that's a pretty high chance of getting one of the 4 Brute Stars in the deck. And then the other two affinity cards that I have in my deck are Assert Authority, which is a counter spell. It originally cost 7, but obviously we're trying to play it for 3 or 2 mana. And then Thoughtcast, which is a 5 mana cost card to draw 2 cards, but obviously we're looking to play it for the 1 blue mana that's included in it.
So a couple things that are in both mine and Tristan's decks are mirror creatures, which mirrors are artifact creatures. Since he was playing Izzet, he has a couple mirrors that focus more on red and blue. So the names are Silver Mirror and Iron Mirror. Silver Mirror adds 1 blue mana to your mana pool, and then Iron Mirror adds 1 red mana to your mana pool. They are both 1/1 creatures. The one that I used is actually Plague Mirror. It has Infect, it is a 1/1, and it adds colorless. I wasn't focusing too much on colored mana. I was mainly focusing on colorless mana because most of my creatures were colorless. The only things that I had that were blue was one single creature and a couple different instances and sorceries. I did use Broodstar, which again, Tristan and I both used that because it does have affinity for artifacts automatically. But let's go over a little bit of the cards in my deck. So I mainly have Blightsteel Colossus as the game winner. On Magic the Gathering Online, it's only a few dollars, but in paper, it's about $60. So again, I probably wouldn't have it in paper form, but Tristan and I mainly practice and test all of these things on Magic the Gathering Online. So if you guys ever wanted to try a deck out, that's a great source to try it out with. And Mycosynth Golem is probably one of the best creatures that were in my deck. The best creature that I had in the deck, though, in my opinion, was Arcane Artisan. What she does is she is a 0/3 creature that has a tap ability. You can pay 2 colorless and an island, then tap her. And what she does is target player draws a card and exiles a card from their hand. If a creature card is exiled this way, that player creates a token that's a copy of that card. When Arcane Artisan leaves the battlefield, exile all tokens created with it at the beginning of the next end step. So again, it's a phenomenal card. The only downside that she has is anytime she leaves the battlefield. It doesn't matter if she gets flickered, bounced back to your hand, if she gets removed from the battlefield, like destroyed, or she dies in any way, all of the tokens created by her do get exiled at the beginning of your end step. So that was a downside. But if you can keep the tokens on the battlefield, it is a huge advantage.
Right, and there are some instances where, like, completely early game, he'd get that out, and by turn 4 or 5, he'd be completely demolishing me. But there are also some other times when I did have answers for that, like the Goblin Charbelcher I talked about, when I was able to just ping it for a few damage by looking at the top few cards in my library and just completely destroying his whole battlefield in one hit.
Yes, but again, if I did manage to keep them on the battlefield, it was absolutely amazing what she can do. The main thing that I tried to do, since he did create a ton of Thopters, was I would bring Steel Hellkite on turn 4, which Steel Hellkite costs 6 to cast, but since I'm only using 3 mana, I can bring him to the battlefield, hopefully on turn 5, get some damage in because the Thopters can't protect him. But if I did any damage to him, Steel Hellkite, I can pay 0, get rid of all the Thopters, or I can pay 4, get rid of his enchantments, different things like that. There's a lot of options with Steel Hellkite. He was definitely a great utility part of this deck. Utility not being like mana wise, but he's just a phenomenal card in the deck for wiping out a lot of the pesky things that the opponent might bring to the table. Again, Blightsteel Colossus was the game winner if I was able to get him on the battlefield, but my main goal of the deck was by turn 4 have a Mycosynth Golem, and then I can get Steel Hellkite, I can get Blightsteel Colossus, I can get any of my creature cards for way less. And with Thopter Spy Network, every upkeep I was creating more Thopters. So I'd have an army on the battlefield, a ton of artifacts that I can reduce all of my things with. It was a phenomenal deck to play, and I greatly enjoyed playing it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed playing it too, and because Affinity is just such a broad spectrum of things that you can build a deck out of, and a lot of things that we didn't do that I wish we could have done and talked about, but it would have been such a long episode. But we'll just touch on a few things. And I know David already talked about it, but Mycosynth Golem is a great card to do a lot of things with. Like something that he didn't do that I think would have been a good idea was to put like four Ethereum Sculptors and four Foundry Inspectors in there. And both of those are creatures that reduce the cost of artifacts by one. And they themselves are artifacts, so those in combination with Mycosynth Golem having affinity for artifacts, you can get that out very quickly, even just by hard casting it. And then with all of those out on the battlefield, you can pretty much cast your entire deck.
Yeah, it's a lot of different options, like Tristan was saying. We chose a few different routes to go, but we would love to hear some feedback from you guys, some of the things that you guys created with Affinity for Artifacts.
Right, and then something that I kind of did, which was creating a ton of Thopters. You could also there's a bunch of different mirror engines that just pump out 1/1 mirrors, or something like Smothering Tithe and other things like that that pump out treasure tokens, which are artifacts. So you can have them to reduce the cost and pay for other things. Another thing that would be great with an artifact heavy deck and like David's, but I didn't really suggest to him. I just kind of thought about it and I forgot to mention it was something like Shimmer Mirror. And what that does, it gives all your artifacts flash. And that would have been insane in your deck and really in any other artifact deck with Affinity for Artifacts because you could just plop down a Blightsteel Colossus on someone else's turn.
Yeah, Flash is an incredible ability. I think that's something we'll eventually talk about in one of our episodes. It's probably going to be a little later because that one's a little bit more unique and it has it's extremely powerful. Again, one of the things that Tristan and I love is Ley Line of Anticipation, which gives all of your spells flash, basically.
Right.
So it's phenomenal. And obviously, it's blue. We both love blue. I'm not phenomenal at blue. Tristan is, but Ley Line of Anticipation is one of the greatest cards that we have in our decks.
Right, and then the one big card that we didn't build around was Tezzeret Master of the Bridge, and that's the newest card that has affinity on it. And in our opinion, it's the best affinity card because when you play it, it gives affinity for artifacts for all other creatures and planeswalkers that you control.
It's crazy. It's so good.
And so basically, what a deck that I found to be most popular with Tezzeret of the Bridge is what would be considered a Super Friends deck. And Super Friends is basically a modern deck, which is just a ton of planeswalkers and things that support that. And so, with having Tezzeret Master of the Bridge in there, it's very easy to cast a bunch of different planeswalkers and combo off of them and do a ton of things and basically seal the game that way. And another great card for Thopters is Psy Master Thopters, which is whenever you cast an artifact, you create a 1/1, and then I believe you can sacrifice an artifact, two artifacts, and then draw a card for 2 mana.
Some honorable mentions that I wanted to bring up because, again, even though we didn't put these two cards in our decks, they're phenomenal just for any artifact deck. There's Padim, Console of Innovation. What he does is he gives all of your artifacts hexproof. And then there's God Pharaoh's Statue, which makes all of the spells opponents cast cost 2 more to cast. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you deal 1 damage to each opponent.
Right, and what Padim also does is at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact with the highest converted mana cost or tied for the highest CMC, then you get to draw a card, which is great because card advantage is huge in blue decks.
Which is why we both put Thoughtcast into our decks. It's just very powerful when you're able to draw cards. Another thing I would like to mention though is Chroma's Memorial. So what that does is it costs 7 colorless mana, but it's an artifact that says creatures you control have flying, first strike, vigilance, trample, and protection from black and from red. The last part doesn't really matter too much, but trample comes in clutch with steel hellkite, like I was mentioning earlier.
Right, and that's a great card combination right there. And another honorable mention I think should be Thopter Assembly because basically what it does is if you don't control any Thopters, you return it to your hand and you put out 5/1/1 Thopter creatures. And that's just a great way to pump out some affinity for artifact fuel. Some weaknesses this deck could have is against a deck that's very control heavy and that's trying to basically just have the board clear at all times. And so it's pretty hard to rebuild after board wipes unless you have things like Thopter Spy Network or Efficient Construction out, especially considering your affinity for artifact cards because if you get board wiped and you lose all your artifacts, you can't really do much until you play more artifacts.
Yeah, and again, another honorable mention that would be really hard to play against is Karn, the Great Creator. It's great for you. It's really not great if the other opponent has it because it shuts down all of your artifacts' activated abilities, which not all of your creatures have activated abilities, but all of the mirrors that we were talking about earlier completely shuts those down. A phenomenal card, which we didn't really mention, but is pretty obvious if you know anything about artifacts, is Mycosynth Lattice. It's one of the greatest cards in the game anyway. It makes every permanent an artifact. It has a couple other things that I won't mention. If you have an interest in Mycosynth Lattice, just look it up. But it makes everything artifacts, which means everything that has affinity for artifacts is basically free, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, and neither of us played with that card because we just thought it would be way too overpowered if one of us had it and the other didn't. And we just want to remind you all that we do play a casual format. So if there's anything that you hear that's like not included in modern or that's banned in everything, we don't think we mentioned anything like that, but just in case we did, we do play casual and just try to have as much fun as possible. And these decks that we are making for all these episodes may not be the greatest or most finely tuned, but we do that on purpose because we don't want anything to be overpowered, and especially if we're trying to play these against decks from previous episodes, they're all about the same power level, which is good for us because it gives us a good judgment of how it does against a variety of decks.
Yeah, we do try to kind of bring the power level up a little bit at a time. We do try to tune them as much as we can. Again, we're not trying to break the format. We're just trying to make fun decks that you can play with friends.
Right. So like we want functional decks that can respond in appropriate ways and interact with enough things on the board so that you can actually stay in the game with other decks and things like that. But other than that, it's pretty laid back.
We just want to say thank you again, guys, for joining us. And be sure to come back to our next episode. We'll be talking about flanking. So you can follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And we also have a YouTube channel, plus our podcast will be streaming on different sources, different hosting platforms. But be sure to check us out on any of those and keep track of what we're doing, and be sure to give us some feedback on any of those platforms just so we can even create a deck that you guys might want. Thanks again.